Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the 2020 International SDG Research Symposium Global Goals 2020. I hope you had a fantastic time, and I hope that you fully enjoyed our virtual conference. We here at Utrecht, we have just done some calculations today about the number of participants in our internet symposium. And we came up with a number that we had more. To the 2020 International SDG Research Symposium Global Goals 2020. Okay, a technical error, sorry. We were live streaming on YouTube and that was apparently a miscommunication, but this is not a problem. So we are back. And again, I welcome you all to the closing plenary of the Global Goals 2020 conference. And as I just said, we have done some calculations about the number of participants that took part in this international research conference. And we came up with a number that more than 1,000 colleagues have taken part in this conference, either as registered participants or as participants through our YouTube channel, international researchers, members of international organizations, members of NGOs, members of governments. More than 1,000 people were here today and the last 2 days and participated in parts of our program. And this is fantastic news. It really shows that online conferences can help to reach a larger audience. It can help to broaden the conversation. It can help to increase the global inclusiveness of our research community. And this is fantastic news, and it shows also that an international dialogue on the SDGs is possible. And this is fantastic. On the other hand, I and many of my colleagues have also expressed that they missed some of the best parts of the physical conferences. I had no small talks at this conference. We had no meetings in the corridors before or after the panels. I had no discussions over dinner, which I missed a lot, and there was no new ideas that we developed over beer after the conference. All this was not possible because it was online, so this we all have to do at some later point of time. And I'm looking forward to that, to future conference, when we can again meet and eat and party and discuss new ideas in a much more interactive, much more fun way. But also this online conference, it was fun. We learned a lot. We had fantastic presentations. So this is the good news, and the bad news is that it is coming to an end. This is the closing plenary. So we have to now end, after 2.5 days, our International SDG Research Symposium. And the good news and the bad news is that we still have 2 fantastic presentations in our program. 2 internationally renowned scholars will share their insight now on the SDGs, Michelle Scobie of the University of the West Indies and John Thompson of IDS Sussex University in the United Kingdom. So they will give 2 presentations right now. We have the same procedures that we had in the other 3 plenary sessions. That means that we want to have your questions. We want you to ask questions to these 2 keynotes. And you can do this by typing your question during both presentations into the Q&A box. So there's a little Q&A box in your Zoom interface. You can just type any question to the 2 presenters while they are talking. There's a democratic element in these questions. That means that you can upvote a question. So if you look at the question that other participants have asked, you can upvote a question by clicking on the thumbs up button, and then the question will be prioritized. And if many people will do it, then it will be in the highest ranked and will most likely be asked. And after these 2 presentations are over, then the 2 co-chairs of this conference, Thomas Hickman and Carol Anthony, they will select questions, especially those questions that have the highest rank, that have been most upvoted. They will select these questions and ask them on your behalf. And because this is a plenary session where we have hundreds of participants, we have set the settings in a way that you cannot see other attendees. So people cannot see you and you can't see other participants in this session. For the same reason, you cannot unmute yourself in this session, and you also are not able to launch your own video. And this is all to ensure the orderly proceedings in this webinar, because we have so many people watching us right now in these talks. So coming up now with the first presentation. And this is a special honor for me to present here, or to introduce my friend and colleague, Michelle Scobie, from the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago, where she is a lecturer and researcher at the Institute of International Relations. And her research in many of her publications cover a very broad area in the field of international and national environmental law, and in particular the perspectives of developing countries on environmental governance, with a focus on a variety of issues, but also on climate change, on tourism. She has published on sustainable development more broadly, on marine governance, on trade environment, and many other issues have been covered in her extensive work. She is the co-editor of the Caribbean Journal of International Relations and Diplomacy, and has been elected to a number of prestigious academic leadership positions. She was a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of Future Earth, the Scientific Steering Committee of the Earth System Governance Project, and also of the Long Range Planning Committee of the International Studies Association. So now Michelle is with us directly from Trinidad and Tobago. And Michelle, are you there? I would invite you now to share your screen. Great to see you. And
Perfect.
It's now,
Thank you.
It's your turn. You have the floor, or the time, or the screen, whatever. Thank you. Michelle Scobie, we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. So just to confirm, is everyone seeing my screen? I take that as a yes. Okay, so just let me let my presentation here. Sorry, this was working just now when we tried it, and I'm not sure what's happening now. Just give me a second. Okay, so is everybody seeing my screen? Yes? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So thanks.
Wonderful.
I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this fantastic conference. I'd like to thank all of those who were involved in planning the conference. And honestly, this is the best online conference that I've attended thus far. So congratulations to everyone involved. And I'm coming at this presentation from the background, as Frank had said, from the perspective of a researcher in and from a small island developing state. And particularly, I was interested in looking at sustainable development goals as pathways, as norm creators, as promoters of better governance, on sustainable development per se. And it's an area that I'm particularly interested in, governance, and particularly insofar as governance influences or affects or enables developing states to manage their affairs.
Michelle, just one
Yes.
input from my side. We cannot see your slides properly. There's only part of the slides visible. So maybe you can just enter the presentation mode. You only see half of the slides, unfortunately, but maybe you can. This is the presentation mode now, and maybe new.
Are you seeing the full slide?
No, we see the slides, but also this is the presentation mode, which we can see. So maybe you can close it again and then open again. I think it will work like this.
This we tried before and it worked. I'm really sorry.
No worries, it will be. Alternatively, what we can do is that we share your slides, which we have here for you, and then you just say next to us. So maybe you can briefly unshare your slides, and then we will upload your slides for you from here.
Okay. Okay. Is it any better? You're still seeing?
No, still it's presentation mode, so it's better, I think, that
okay. Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
Problem.
So please do that. Thank you. So I'm on slide 2.
Great.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm on slide 2, so you can move to the second slide. Yeah. So the what I wanted to examine in this this plenary presentation was the extent to which we can see the SDGs as creating a set of governance norms that could drive sustainable development processes. And of course, if there are such norms and if they could drive sustainable development processes, well, that goes beyond the indicators as we know them now, which relate to particular areas of the SDGs, but looking at the SDGs more broadly. And we can say, well, is there something that looks at this? And the answer is yes. No, that we know that the literature has spoken about the power of norms and the capacity of norms, but also in this particular case, I wanted to look at what states consider their responses to some of these norms to be through their voluntary national reviews that states voluntarily submit to the high-level political forum that meets annually to examine SDG implementation. So my interest is in looking at norm penetration and norm dynamics. What are the things that help norms to penetrate, to cascade, and what are the things that create norm contestation, particularly in the perspective of developing states? Of course, this is very important for anybody interested in developing states development and also in considering SDGs and in terms of governance. No? So we can move to the next slide, please. Well, yeah, so obviously the question is to look at what are the sort of elements behind this, no? And for that, I created what I consider, I guess, norm penetration dynamic. And we have global norms and we have national norms. So the global norms, let's say, come from the international forum, but we also have national norms that contest those global norms that tend to weaken them. And in the middle, we have that norm implementation, and some people speak about action coherence in the literature, and there's also in the literature discussions on norm cascade, where those norms sort of penetrate international policy and national institutional arrangements. So there's a question of, so to speak, the power of the SDGs. Could we say that the SDGs have power to contribute to national priority, policy setting, and to institutional arrangements for the benefit of improved sustainable development governance? So we can move to the next slide. So of course, we're looking at Caribbean islands, and many of you have been, and the rest of you are cordially invited to visit our beautiful shores. Lovely countries, wonderful to visit, great for holiday, but there are certain systemic challenges that affect SDG implementation. Jamaica's population, it's the largest country in this 4-country study that I'm conducting. It's a study of 4 countries that I thought I could look at for the purpose of this presentation. I'm looking at Jamaica in the north. We're looking at the Bahamas, which is an archipelago of 700 islands. Looking at St. Lucia, the smallest, and Guyana, which is also considered a small island developing state, although it's located on the South American mainland. Jamaica has a population of about 2.7 million. No? Its GDP per capita, just to give you one figure, was 4,781, as compared to, for example, 42,716 US dollars for the period 2015 to 2018. The Bahamas, as I said, archipelago of 700 islands, a population of 351,000 13% of the population is considered poor. Its GDP per capita was 23,316 for the same period. St. Lucia, the smallest of the islands that I'm studying, is 181,000 people. Its GDP per capita was 8,363. Again, it's a country that every year has hurricanes which throw the country back in terms of development substantially as they need to rebuild crucial infrastructure, etc. Guyana is the southernmost country. It has 779,000 people. It's one of the smallest in terms of population densities in the world. Most of the population lives on the coast, 90%. The coast is 1.5 meters below sea level at high tide, making it very vulnerable to climate change, storm surges, etc., etc. So we're looking at countries that already have geographical, climatic, but also systemic and governance challenges, serious governance challenges. Many have low GDP per capita, but also have high debt ratios, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've decided to examine what are the norms and that we could say that drive SDG governance. Are there SDG governance norms, so to speak? And I've come up with 5. If we look at so this slide shows the norm and then the implementation pathway. And I thought we could look at 5. And these 5 relate to both UN documents as well as VNRs, voluntary national reviews. And these are really the areas, the institutional mechanisms that drive or allow for improved SDG governance. So I'm using, of course, the literature that comes from norm penetration, as well as sociological world theorist literature on the power of international fora to contribute to a changed or improved or different sort of national policy making. No? So norms develop, they penetrate, they are contested, and then they cascade. And I'm applying that to this diagram here. And we look at these 5. Adaptability. To what extent states are able to take the SDGs and make them part of their own national plans. Coherence, whole of government implementation. This has been absolutely essential, yet it's absolutely challenging. You know? And some of my work on policy coherence and small island developing states speak to the challenge that small countries have with limited resources and limited institutional arrangements to be able to coordinate the SDGs. And I argue in one of my pieces that the SDGs as framed sort of perpetuate the siloed approach, and then that siloed approach is applied at the national level as departments lobby and fight for funding from international organizations, in the case of small island developing states, perpetuating the opposite of whole of government or coherence in implementation perspectives. Third is high-level political support, absolutely necessary. In small island developing states like ours, where we are on a bicameral system, where we have two large political parties, often when one party comes in, it just throws out what was done by the previous. And therefore, engaging Parliament and having entire parliamentary support is essential. That's been considered important by the United Nations as well as budgeting for the SDGs. Now, with COVID, etc., we can see even budgeting taking a step back as countries need to invest more of their very scarce resources into addressing the fallout from this global health pandemic. Participation of all stakeholders, again, very important. I include here engagement and equipping of public servants, but also civil society and the private sector. And globally, this has been a movement that has been encouraged. It underlies a lot of the SDG implementation, but again, something that often small island developing states struggle with. Civil society itself needs more capacity building to be able to effectively contribute. And again, some of my work examines what are some of the challenges that make this difficult in terms of participation in SDG decision-making, policy formulation, implementation, monitoring, etc. And finally, last but not least, I consider one of the key norms, science-based policy, science-based decision-making. And that really speaks to getting the data for SDG implementation, but also the involvement of supreme audit institutions, something that generally is not as easily implemented in many states and even more so in Caribbean countries. So we can move to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so what have I done? I tried to examine these norms. So we see in the first column the norms. In the third column, you see the implementation pathways, those areas that relate to each of the norms. So for example, the third norm, high-level political support, has 2 implementation pathways, which is budgeting and parliamentary involvement, etc., etc. And I looked at the VNRs for the 4 states. So we talk about St. Lucia, Guyana, Bahamas, Jamaica, and the extent to which these states have been able to incorporate the governance norm via the implementation pathways. So I use green for 2, the value of 2, which is the highest on ordinal scale of 0 to 2. That's the greatest norm penetration and cascade. That means the involvement, the application of the norm. I use an ordinal scale of, I use 1 with the color yellow to signify where there has been some mention in the VNRs of this norm or the implementation pathway, but without it actually being implemented through particular arrangements. And I use 0 for the, when I looked at the VNRs where there was no evidence of any implementation pathway, any institutional arrangement for that implementation pathway, budgeting and parliament involvement, for example. So if you just look at this graph quite quickly, we see that in terms of the power of SDGs as norm brokers to contribute to improve governance, sustainable development governance in these ways, small states like the Caribbean have still a long way to go. And there are many reasons for this, and the countries themselves explain some of these reasons in their own VNRs. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So let's look at it graphically. Adaptability. So this is a characteristic of Caribbean states. We're very interested in international affairs and very interested in adopting the best practices for our countries. And therefore, all of the states examined and all of the Caribbean states have incorporated the SDGs into their development plans in some way. And all of the states have development plans, 2040 development plans, sustainable development plans, green development plans, and they all include the SDGs and explain the extent to which they are compatible with the SDGs. And that's why you see 100% sort of incorporation of the adaptability norm. And there things get a little harder. Some countries like St. Lucia and Jamaica have actually sought to incorporate whole of development approaches, and there you see attempts to create either new agencies or high-level coordinating mechanisms of all the agencies to be able to together examine implementation of their own sustainable development plans that, as I said, have been adapted to or adapt to the SDG goals. But then you go really low, high-level political support. That's one that we're still it's very difficult for Caribbean states. Participation in some of these agencies that I was mentioning, there is the involvement of the private sector or the civil society, at least in theory, and then science-based decision-making. All states recognize that they're very limited on the ability to gather the data. No, we still have a long way to go in data gathering, data processing, etc. Move to the next slide, please. And then this is a view of the same states. We have at the bottom of the graph, Jamaica, Bahamas, Guyana, and St. Lucia, color-coded for each of the norms, which is in bold, in capital, sorry, and then the implementation pathways. And here you could see, answering the question just using this graph, to what extent the SDGs could be considered to be norm brokers or useful as norms to help sustainable development in small island developing states. And 0 to 2, it's because I use that 0 means no policy and no mechanisms were mentioned in the VNRs, to 2, where we could see that the policy has been mentioned and also the mechanisms have been implemented. So we see a variety, and I wanted to show this slide to say that not all states have the same level of penetration of the SDG norms. Jamaica is much more advanced than some of the other states. Guyana is particularly weak on many of these areas. And this accounts for their own internal processes of institutional building. And Jamaica has, even from the MDGs, have sought to begin a process of greater policy coherence, a greater considering of what their own development policy means. Can you move to the next slide, please? And here, just graphically, we see if you are, for example, someone interested in developing states policy making, here we see where the countries need greater support. So it's proportionately on adaptation and coherence. There seems to be greater uptake of these of the norms, but on points like high-level political support, parliament, budgeting, etc., these states struggle. So if it comes to where can we support these states, often we think about SDG implementation, and it's about, I don't know, contributing to wastewater management or supporting coral reefs, etc. But none of those directed and sectoral policies seem to work long term, I argue, and I continue to argue, because we don't address governance. And here we see quite graphically the problems of governance that any policy, any project, any research project that you'd like to work on will face. And to the extent to which these research projects, these international development aid, these forms of aid are able to provide and support these areas of governance, I think we can see greater long-term continuation of the policy and greater effectiveness of the policy long-term. Move on to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So this is at a glance the four things that I wanted to talk about in this paper. I go into a lot more detail. This just represents the summary of it all. So I say that, you know, we can think about the SDGs as norm brokers, even as those norms contest with local realities. And the VNRs of these states reflect what some of those local realities are. Jamaica, which has done the best, if you look at the top table on the right, Jamaica that has done the best still struggles, it says in its VNR. Yet, the main challenges for the full implementation of the SDGs are primarily in the following areas: financing, policy coherence, effective development of coordination across sectors, data for monitoring and accountability. So even in Jamaica that has greater evidence of norm implementation and cascade, it still recognizes some of these. And why? Because of the systemic factors that underlie the governance systems in these countries, no? And others, no, those on the inside, but they're also systemic barriers to trade, a great indebtedness of these countries, high levels of crime in the case of Jamaica, insufficient access to finance. All of these countries have graduated out of concessional financing arrangements, which they contest strongly, which means that the finance that they need to develop these governance systems are not easily available at concessional rates in the international community. And it affects the ability for SDG implementation and certainly SDG governance. There's simply no budget to incorporate everyone and to have greater participation of all stakeholders, much less many of the more targeted areas of SDG development. So obviously, these systemic challenges, this lack of financial resources, even problems of migration, many of these countries, the people are quite capable. They go abroad seeking a better life, and it means that the country seems to be always starting over. The government departments are always starting over, and this also affects obviously coherence in there and continuity in policy making. So in conclusion, my point is that it's interesting to look at the SDGs and to consider not only what the individual SDGs can do for the state, but the SDGs as a whole and the SDGs as norm brokers. And what are some of those governance norms that can drive SDG implementation? And then I looked at how SIDS, how small states grapple with policy coherence, with adaptability to local context, with adopting high-level political support, with the participation of stakeholders, both public servants as well as the civil society and the private sector. And finally, the challenges of supreme audit institutions, the lack of their use and their ability to contribute to examining governance as we have it now and contributing by suggestions, reports, etc., to improve governance. So I hope that this paper has been able, this presentation has been able to highlight some of the gaps in SDG governance. And if any development partners are listening, well, this is one of the areas that I think would be quite useful. And I think that this forum on global goals has been very helpful because it throws light on the power and the value of the SDGs to contribute to sustainable development in developing states. So that's it for me. My last slide is just a thank you. You can move to the last slide. Okay, great. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. It was a great presentation, very important insights also from the Caribbean region. And I see already that a couple of questions are being asked about your presentation, but we have agreed, as I mentioned before, that we ask all these questions after the second presentation in one block of Q&A. So for all the participants in this plenary, if you have any questions left for Michelle, you can just type them in right now into the Q&A box. And the same is also the case for the next presentation. Coming to which, I have the honor now to introduce John Thompson, who is the Vice Director of the Sussex Sustainability Research Program at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. And he's also there a research fellow with the Institute for Development Studies and serves as the joint coordinator of the Future Agriculture Consortium, aiming there to encourage critical debate and policy dialogue on the future of agriculture, in particular in Africa, but also in other developing regions. And before that, he had many other functions before. One was that he was the director of the Sustainable Agriculture and Rural Livelihood Program at the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, and a number of other functions. He is especially focusing for the last 25 years, I believe, on issues of power, policy, sustainability, with a focus on food and agriculture. And today, he has a very, very timely issue. So he wanted to talk with us about the SDGs, but also linked to Corona. So it's all about Corona, COVID-19, the crisis, and catalyst. So his title of his presentation is Crisis as Opportunity, maybe a question mark we should add, using the global pandemic to catalyze a just and sustainable recovery. John, you have the floor, and I would invite you now to share your screen and your PowerPoint with us. And
okay, can you see that now? I've got it sharing.
Yes, we can, John.
Very good. And you can see my main slide, my first slide. Thank you. Frank, thank you so much. Thank you to you and the entire team at the University of Utrecht for this opportunity, for making the symposium such a success over the last 3 days. I know how much work went into it over the last year, and what a disappointment it is that we weren't able to meet together face to face, to have that beer, to have those side discussions. But I think nonetheless, it was a real success. As you said, it was very well attended over the last few days. Certainly I enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak at the end of the event. What I want to do is use this time to reflect a bit about the COVID crisis, because it certainly has affected us all, and it's going to continue to affect us all over the next several years, if not the rest of this decade in various ways. And so I want to reflect a bit on that crisis and how the pandemic has thrown up a major challenge to the entire global community, as well as local communities around the world, while also giving us an opportunity to reset the trajectory that we've been following for the past several decades and start to rethink where we're going from here. It's really been an abrupt shock that's affected governments, it's affected companies, businesses, it's affected civil society in all kinds of ways. So it is certainly a crisis of really unusual size, but it's also potentially a catalyst. Now, when I first came up with the name of this talk, I talked of it being using the global pandemic to catalyze a just and sustainable recovery. But after a bit more reflection, I thought, actually, what we're talking about is something more fundamental to that. As we've heard over the last few days of the symposium, that this whole thing is taking us well beyond a recovery to start, because that really suggests returning to a status quo after some course corrections. And we're thinking here about something much more radical, more fundamental, much more transformative. So perhaps the talk would be better termed using the global pandemic to catalyze a just and sustainable transformation. Now, we are talking about sustainability in the time of COVID. And I want to take us back to quite a famous quote by Charles Dickens in his Tale of Two Cities, the opening line of which reads, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was an epoch of belief, it was an epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of despair. It was a spring of hope, it was the winter of despair." And I think in some ways that is an apt reflection of our times, both the dark and dim side of things that we're facing, but also potentially a spring of hope. And so that's how I want to get us to think a little bit more about the SDGs going forward. Because never in modern history has one event, the COVID pandemic, had such a far-reaching effect, far-ranging effect on the world. And we've seen some analysts describe this shock as accelerating a shift from what they've been describing as the great integration of increasing integration and globalization of economies around the world, of global trade, of movement of goods and people, and so on, towards a great fragmentation. And that's something that's been described in a number of recent studies, that you've seen as a result of COVID, states start to contract, to move away from that interaction, from the opening up of borders. And we've seen restrictions to trade and investment. We've seen and which is likely to continue. We've seen people blocked from moving from one part of the world to another. There have been all sorts of changes in commodity prices. There have been large blockages of capital outflows, declining remittances, weaker healthcare systems, the blocking of informal workers to entire sectors of the economy. And so we've seen this shrinkage, we've seen these blockages, we've seen what some describe as fragmentation. However, we've also seen people start to say, well, wait a second here. After the great lockdown that we're all facing, what comes next? Is it going to be continuing fragmentation? Are we going to be going back to the way things were? Or are we going to do a more fundamental rethink towards a great transformation? And certainly that's some language that we've seen emerging from a variety of places. And my question to this audience and to all of us in the sustainable development community is, how can we avoid that great fragmentation getting worse in the coming months and years? And what would a great transformation look like in this post-pandemic period? And how do we bring that about? And importantly for this audience, what role can the Sustainable Development Goals play in that transformation? And Michelle referred to the importance of governance, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But first, just to set the scene, we've faced a number of crises. Even before COVID struck, we were facing a very serious climate emergency. And that was mobilizing the international community over quite a few years to try to address this in some ways. The pinnacle of effort so far in terms of global response was the Paris Agreement of 2015. However, as I'll describe, despite most governments signing up to that agreement, significant resistances remain among states, among private sector, among the public. And it's really taken a youth-led climate justice movement, along with the scientific community, to push for reform, to open up a space for debate on how to operationalize those commitments made in Paris. But we aren't there yet, and there's been some discussion about how we move that forward, and I'll mention that in a moment. But while we've been trying to grapple with that climate emergency, we were struck by COVID. And that has led to a whole cascade of other crises that we've encountered in recent months. A major economic crisis linked to a social crisis, and I would say also combined with a governance crisis. And so we've had these multiple intersecting, interlocking crises that the world is facing now on a global scale. It's affecting us all to one degree or another, though not equally. And I'll come back to that. First, the climate crisis as background. As we know, after the gavel came down in the Paris Agreement in 2015, governments formally acknowledged that their national climate targets would not meet the goal of limiting warming to 1.5%. And in fact, since that agreement a few years ago, there's been a fair bit of slippage, a lot of talk, not a lot of real action to meet this commitment. And so the Climate Action Tracker, for example, has been finding that very few governments have actually been able to step up to move beyond some of those initial claims and agreements that were set in Paris. And all the indications are that we're not going to be able to stay within that 1.5% boundary, and likely moving upwards of 2.8% and beyond, at least under the current conditions, the current arrangements and implementations that we've seen so far. As I mentioned, COVID hit us several months ago. As of a couple of days ago, the WHO has reported nearly 7 million confirmed cases, and many estimates suggest there are many beyond that, and that there are well over 400,000 deaths. So the situation is dire, and it's certainly affecting countries around the world, though not populations equally, for sure. We've seen certain parts of the world that have already been struggling with lack of decent healthcare coverage, also being hit with this. There are major concerns about a second wave coming, which could actually lead to even greater problems, perhaps in some of the poorest parts of the world that already lack access to decent healthcare, access to water and basic sanitation, and this could deprive many people of the preventive measures necessary to battle against the virus, such as just basic hand washing, for example. Now that's been also sparked as governments have shut down and had to close down sections of the economy due to lockdown and various sorts of health and hygiene restrictions. We've seen this unprecedented set of restrictions lead to a triggering of deep recessions around the world, both in advanced economies and in emerging market and developing economies. The World Bank recently put out its a half-yearly report, the Global Economic Prospects Report, which said that this has triggered a widespread global meltdown, the largest since at least 1870, and that we're seeing that, we're expecting GDP to shrink by at least 5.2% this year, and that we could see this recession being twice as deep as the one that occurred in 2008. In fact, it's the highest share of countries in recession in the last 150 years. So we're looking at 90% of the 183 economies the World Bank reviewed being affected with major falls of GDP. The OECD has also put out its recent economic outlook, which mirrors some of the analysis that the World Bank showed. And they did a number of scenario analyses, neither of which really looks very good. They combined a single hit scenario where we have one major wave of coronavirus and then bringing things under control, and then a double hit. In both cases, we're seeing major disruptions to economies north and south. Under a single hit scenario, we're seeing global economic activity fall by somewhere in the neighborhood of 6%, and that OECD unemployment will climb to about 9.2%. And then if there's a double whammy, a double hit scenario, then figures look even worse, with world economic output plummeting to well over 7% this year before starting to climb back a little bit in 2021. Now, in addition to the economic crisis, we've seen that the COVID lockdown and all the economic ramifications have exacerbated a whole number of intersecting inequalities, which some presenters talked about earlier in the symposium, which is driving increasing poverty and marginalization. And sadly, some of the most vulnerable are those already most at risk. People who are facing war and conflict, the young, the elderly, the sick and disabled, those most lacking access to basic social and political protections and other sorts of support. And we've seen that they're projecting this year somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million people risk falling into extreme poverty as a result of this shock that's affecting us all. And women are among the hardest hit. They make up 70% of the health workers globally and provide 5% of unpaid care work for all the others in our communities and our households that need assistance. At the same time, we've also seen in more recent weeks how the COVID crisis has affected racial inequalities around the world and really pushed people to the margins and forced them to come out on the streets, which I'll talk about in a moment. So we've seen these intersecting crises. All of them could be described as wicked problems. These are problems that are difficult to define clearly, have many causes and interdependencies, have unforeseen consequences and huge uncertainties, which makes governments and international bodies who try to move towards control of future trajectories and policies and programs highly uncomfortable. They're often very unstable. They have no clear solution in most cases. They're often socially complex, and they don't come under the responsibility of any single organization. And often they involve a requirement to change behavior. Now, in previous studies done by the UN Environment Program, looking at behavior change related to environmental practice and management, they found that often behavior change took over 30 years, 3 decades, before you saw a fundamental shift in individual behavior and institutional behavior to embrace different ways of working and so on. Now, 30 years is a long time. You could trace back the climate change debate and say that kind of fits that mold very well when we were discussing this through the 90s, pushing things over the last 20 years, and it's only 2015 that we finally reached that Paris Agreement. But when we have a crisis in the proportion that we have now, with all COVID and other things, changing behavior is going to happen sooner than later. We can't wait 30 years. Now, when we think about the role of science in transformations to sustainable development, wicked problems fit into that zone of uncertainty, as I mentioned, where there's a lot of questions about how do we approach these things? What do we need to do? These are contested, they're big knowledge gaps. Both the scientific and societal actors struggle to figure out the way forward, and there are differing views on best practices, best approaches. So there's a need to jointly define problems, co-produce knowledge, and seek solutions guided by equity and justice. But it's not easy, as we'll discuss. So what I'm arguing is that today's policy responses to these multiple overlapping crises, these wicked problems, are going to be shaping our collective economic, ecological, and social prospects for the coming decade and well beyond. Now we can see crisis as an opportunity. The Chinese word for crisis means danger at the point of juncture. But in the West, over quite a few years now, it's been incorrectly interpreted as two symbols meaning danger and opportunity. I think it's been criticized that framing of that expression, but nonetheless, I think that phrase, crisis as opportunity, does have value and is being used widely now to discuss the where next in this post-pandemic era. Another common phrase is never waste a good crisis. That's something that's been around, certainly going back to Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy, and others. It's been used in a variety of business settings as well. Several politicians more recently have used the expression to focus attention on the climate crisis and promoting various versions of the so-called Green New Deal. And with COVID, a number of leaders have evoked the phrase to talk about a redoubling of efforts to implement the SDGs. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. The elders, you may know this group, an independent group of global leaders working together on peace, justice, and human rights that was set up by Nelson Mandela. They've recently come out with a set of statements and video clips and so on, and made the point that COVID-19 shines a light on our common humanity and shared vulnerabilities. And it's only through a collective, collaborative response that all our fundamental interests can be served. So we're talking about opening up sustainability, but we need to think a little bit more about what exactly is to be sustained or transformed, for whom and by whom. This means linking sustainability to specific qualities of equity, social justice, and environmental integrity, and recognizing that, as Michelle was referring to, while we have these global understandings, we also recognize that the implementation of the goals is going to be very context specific and invariably contested. And therefore, it makes public deliberation and negotiation about these goals essential. We need that debate, we need that deliberation if we're going to find not a single way ahead, but plural ways ahead that are going to achieve the sustainability, the transformations we're seeking with that equity, social justice, and environmental integrity in mind. That means thinking about structural and enabling change, thinking about how these multiple crises can take us beyond a recovery that's just about resetting business as usual. That's not an option, towards more major, massive transformations, where we're thinking about a sustainability that's not only socially just, but possibly even emancipatory. That's going to require structural reforms, structural changes, as well as enabling conditions. And that's going to be driving change from both below and above. Now, we've seen that COVID has sparked in recent days a set of protests, demonstrations on the streets, but even before COVID hit, we saw how there were demonstrations around climate justice that were pushing leaders, both public politicians and private sector, to think differently about how we address this climate emergency. More recently, we've seen all these concerns about Black Lives Matter and police brutality and so on, as getting people on the streets to think about racial injustice as well. And we can see from the history of these sorts of demonstrations that unruly politics is something that often happens with people mobilizing without any leadership, of people taking the streets because they're fed up, because they don't see the change that they desire. And that leads to this kind of concern about contagion, of those politics spreading, of those demonstrations moving elsewhere out of control of authorities, and incumbent powers start to open spaces that they would otherwise keep closed and be more willing to make real concessions at that point. I think we're seeing some of that happening now.
Okay.
So we're seeing social renewal and democratic progress. That depends vitally on these episodes of extra institutional disorder as much as on the formal institutions of politics. Now, in addition to the politics from below, these unruly politics, we also see the need to have politics from above that opens spaces, that facilitates change. But we've seen that most governments since the 80s have followed a neoliberal agenda, which is more or less let business steer the way forward to create wealth and only intervening when there's a need to fix market failures. But we've seen that COVID has really forced us to rethink the role of the state in driving change. There's an argument that now we need to reassert the central role of an effective, capable, and enabling public sector to respond to society's needs, to build resilience and deal with crises, not only as they arise, but even before, to prepare for them adequately.
John, may I ask you, we have many questions in the Q&A box. Would be great if you could wrap up, because then we have the opportunity to direct some of these questions directly to you.
Okay, I'm going to have to move quickly then. I'll do my best. What I want to talk about here is just a little warning, though, when we're thinking about the role of the state. And this comes from Naomi's work on the shock doctrine. And this is where we've seen already how governments, other actors have used the shock of COVID to start to close down some of those spaces and limit opportunities. And there's this so-called shock therapy, which follows a clear crisis through policy change. And the 1940s, following the second operation of that, following COVID, following the coordinated action for certainty, the dynamics of ways to sustainability or directions of the local and the global that can broaden out inputs to debates involved in the symposium can start. And the question is, can it implement the SDGs? Just as we're talking about government economies, deal with social unrest, deal with the health crisis, but it is opening up a new space to rethink where we're going and how we get there. The agenda securing greater leadership, more resources and smarter solutions. It's also talking about local action to embed the needed transitions in the policies, budgets, institutions, and regulatory frameworks at all people action, generating an unstoppable movement, transformations, which to some degree, I think we're already starting to see. Well, I want to come to a couple of quick points.
Can you wrap up now? Because we now also want to take some questions from the floor, and also to Michelle. So we have 30 seconds to wrap up, please. Is this okay?
All right, well, I'll come to this point, and that is a comment that Amina Mohammed, the UN Deputy Secretary General, made recently. And she said the SDGs are no longer an aspirational set of goals for some distant future. They're the minimum we need to secure a safer, more just, and more sustainable world for all. And that's where I think we are at the moment. This is the SDG moment. And I think we are in a place to catalyze that change. It's the worst of times, but potentially it's also the best of times. The SDGs are ideally placed to serve in the role, this catalytic role. There are no others to help foster a sustainable and emancipatory transformation for all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. We now ask you to unshare your screen. It's nice that we really I can feel your enthusiasm about the SDGs. It's really nice. And obviously we have been worked hard over the past couple of days and weeks maybe to make such a current analysis of the effects of the COVID-19 crisis pandemic on the SDGs. And also thank you to Michelle. And we would like now to go over to the Q&A. And I have one question for Michelle from the Q&A box. Maybe I start with 2 questions for Michelle, and then Michelle, you can pick and choose, maybe also address briefly both of these questions. The first question comes from Maya Buchers from Utrecht University. She thanks you very much for your presentation. And then she wants to have your opinion about the following one. Do you think that the SDGs as a set of global norms are fit for purpose to facilitate the policy coherence, if the SDGs themselves have been called incoherent, inconsistent on several targets? Question mark. Second one, maybe it's related to from Felix Dotz. He's asking about the connection between civil society and stakeholders, whether there are different theories and mixing them is not a good idea or is a good idea. That's the question here. Civil society discourse reduces space for key stakeholders and excludes key ones such as academics. So should have stakeholders mapping, he wants to have it here.
Yeah.
Michelle, can you briefly react on that?
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks for the questions, and I enjoyed your presentation very much, John, as well. So first, Maya, I completely agree with you. Before the SDGs, I stuck my neck out and said that it seems that some people just wanted to continue in their jobs and created a new framework to propel a continuing set of goals or actions, and that's kind of drastic. Later, I looked at the SDGs and I suggest that they actually contribute as established now to policy incoherence, because they continue to drive those silos in implementation in many cases. So the short answer is that they don't necessarily help with coherence, but here I distinguish the SDGs and the SDG norms, because in addition to these siloed goals, we have a set of norms which I try to distinguish and highlight, which promote policy coherence. No? And precisely that promotion of policy coherence, if applied, and we see states trying to do that, can contribute to better policy coherence. And we see that in Jamaica. Jamaica has created a high-level institutional framework that allows all of the SDGs to simultaneously be considered in implementing policy. St. Lucia is also trying to do something similar. And precisely in countries where we have limited resources, this is even more important, because we don't have the luxury of addressing one goal and then another and then another. So here I distinguish between the individual SDGs and the governance norms behind those that can drive improved policy coherence. But that's all debatable, and I'm not completely sold on either idea. So yeah, the second question, thanks for that question. The challenge that we have is in our case is simply just bringing people to the table. So we haven't quite reached the stage where we distinguish between stakeholders as indigenous groups. By the way, in the Caribbean, there are not really too many indigenous groups. We have small pockets of them. But they are also at the table. So again, in the cases where there have been attempts to introduce dialogue with the non-state sector, they've all been at the table: the academics, the NGOs, the indigenous communities, youth, women, gender, etc. So there, I try to bring all of those together, because the idea there was looking at the norm, not looking at stakeholder mapping, but looking at the norm of the involvement of people other than the government in shaping sustainable governance policy going forward. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks a lot, Michelle, for your comprehensive answer. We also have questions for John. For instance, David Kuhn from Utrecht University thanks you very much for your talk, and wonders whether public deliberation is enough to touch the fundamental power structures causing or facilitating the multiple crises you described. Do we also need struggles, fights, uprisings, he asks? And if so, which is the role of academia in that?
Thank you, David. It's a really good question, and that's the point I was trying to make about the unruly politics. When you look at the history of of people's movements, of social movements, going back over the last couple of centuries, almost invariably, social change, political change happens when people take to the streets, when the incumbent powers get nervous about losing control, when they start to be forced to make concessions. And in between, there is often a certain accommodation that occurs and takes time, and a certain co-optation, often of the movement leaders being brought into the inner circle to sit at the table as representatives. But in between, when there are those moments when people do feel that they've got to take action, often that's action that happens without formal leadership, without formal institutions, and that's where things can get quite dangerous. And we've seen a certain amount of that over the last 6 weeks or so, a certain amount of violence, a certain amount of unfortunate incidents. But at the same time, we've seen this commitment, global commitment at that local level of people saying, we need to change things, and I'm prepared to make a difference by going out in the street and expressing my discontent and calling for action. And that has led to action as a result. And I would say with the not necessarily, I can't see people demonstrating about the SDGs, but they'll be demonstrating about poverty and inequality, about food insecurity, about fundamental things that touch their lives, which connect directly to the SDGs. And one of the things, our role as researchers, and I would say engaged activists, is that we need to be able to communicate both to those people who are taking to the streets about the value of the SDGs in helping to connect up government and governance systems to try to bring about change that's more than just at the local level, systemic change, structural change. And so it's going to require not just action at the local, but connecting up to the state level, as I described, and to the global system as well, to bring about that transformational change. And there we can play a role.
Great, thanks. Thanks, John, for your answer. If I may, there's also a question from Marianne Beisheim from SWP. She's asking, the SDGs do not answer the how questions. How do we get there? But the TSDR tried to define pathways with entry points and levers. What role do you see for these in the COVID-19 recovery? Are these suggestions still the way to go? Do we maybe need to adjust certain features?
Is that directed at me? Yes. I would say yes, that there's going to be, this is where I said there's going to be a need for a lot of public deliberation and a certain amount of contestation to think about the directionality of where we want to go and how we want to get there, who's involved in making those decisions and so on. SDGs are not a clear roadmap. They offer a set of goals and principles and targets, which are helpful. But in terms of where we go from here, that's something that's going to have to happen through an extensive set of negotiations, which is why, as I'm saying, having some unruly politics from below can help open up a space for that deliberation and critical reflection. And then for others like the research community to come in to bring new evidence and analysis that can inform some of those deliberations and get a shift in thinking. And it often takes a shock like this to have that moment where some action can happen, where there can be opportunities to say we've got to break out of this silo, of this singular pathway, and recognize that there are alternatives that are viable, but they're going to take a commitment, they're going to take investment of different sorts of resources in order for them to be opened up and allow people to move forward.
Thanks, John. Yeah, let's maybe move to one or two more general questions. We're coming to the end of the Q&A already. But this is a quite important one from Giselle Sensoro from Newcastle University. She's asking about, what is the role of the researchers? I think, John, you touched upon this in your presentation already, but I think it's a big topic we should now also talk about here in the Q&A. So the question is, we are now at the end of the symposium. Seems like there's no question that is obvious that the SDGs have gaps and it's competing with many other things happening in the world. How can we as researchers drive the necessary and immediate action that is important to make progress on the SDGs? So it's about the question, we as academics, what can we do about the SDGs? Maybe Michelle, can you briefly start to address this question?
Thanks, Thomas. I think, it's an interesting question. And I think it speaks to the wealth of participants in this conference that we're concerned not just researching, but we would like to make a change. And I think that's quite admirable, really, for a group of academics and researchers and other interested persons. And I think that as researchers, I think one of the first things, at least I feel passionately about this, is there's not unidirectionality. No? I really don't like the word driving change, because that suggests going in one direction. And the kind of issues that we have as academics, as researchers, what we can do is recognize the different directions that may be useful in different contexts. And I think our own research and many of the presentations throughout the last 2.5 days have been recognizing context-specific changes. And sometimes, I mean, looking at the graph showing unemployment falling drastically in the OECD, that's still much higher than, much less unemployment that we've ever had in the Caribbean. So again, context is important, and understanding that is important in implementing, and the researchers can really contribute to that. Otherwise, it can seem to be one gloss of actions that can improve in everybody's case. And sometimes improving one set of situations might not necessarily lead to improvements overall, but may actually reduce. So I think as researchers, putting the highlight on that is really important. And of course, going out into the streets as well. But in addition to going out in the streets, when we come back home, try to work on these things so we can give more fuel to the arguments of those who go out into the streets. Yeah.
Good point. Thanks, Michelle. John, do you have a key message to that?
Yeah, I'd say three quick things. One is I skipped over a slide where I was highlighting synergies. One of the things that I'm concerned about recognizing we're facing an unprecedented multidimensional crisis. Governments are struggling and will continue to struggle for the foreseeable future. International agencies will struggle. There are problems of resources, of capacities to be able to meet all these multiple crises and address the challenges that follow. So we need to think about how do we, as I think Michelle was referring to as well, think about synergistic change. Rather than that siloed approach to individual goals, we need to be looking for the synergies that can bring multiple benefits and also address some of the trade-offs at the same time. So thinking about those multipliers, where we get the most bang for the buck in some ways, how we make the most of the least, that's a critical element and a role for research to try to analyze and understand the synergies. The second is around understanding how we can move from a command and control type of thinking, which is still what governments are doing, of closing down around risk and thinking they can manage their way out of this. As I said, we're dealing with wicked problems, huge uncertainty. It means we're going to have to navigate all sorts of complexity rather than have a clear roadmap to get us to where we want to be. A lot of trial and error, a lot of experimentation. So thinking about how we move from control to more of a care-based approach, where we make sure we bring those people who are on the margins with us, that's going to be critical. And that brings me to issues of collective action and care, of mutuality, which we've already seen emerge from this crisis, which is really, I think, one of the most important lessons to come from it. Around the world, people have responded and supported their neighbors, supported their communities without any government help, without any external intervention. We need to learn from that and how we build on that. It's already there. People are willing to do it, and we need more of the same, just happening on a larger scale. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Michelle, for your wonderful presentations. And also thank you to our attendees for their questions and comments. We unfortunately have to close the Q&A session now, but I invite you to stay for the last part of the concluding plenary session of the Global Goals 2020 Symposium, the conclusion of the concluding plenary. Frank, over to you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Yeah, this is the conclusion of the concluding plenary of our 2.5-day conference. They were great presentations. I very much enjoyed the last two, and I very much also enjoyed the discussion. And I think we could go on in discussing these issues, but unfortunately, we have to come to an end. And also because this is an online conference, we really have to stick with the time. So therefore, we have no more presentations. We have to conclude our conference today. For us, it was a big experiment in many ways. We have never done a 3-day conference purely online with 1,000 participants. We were used to webinars. We were used to online discussions here and there, but to have a conference with 1,000 participants was new to us. And I believe it was also new to many of you. And for that reason, we will be very interested in your feedback. And we have two mechanisms for this feedback. The one is that we will design, or we have already designed, a survey that we will send out to all registered participants, in which you can share your feedback, your insights, your evaluation of the various aspects of our online symposium, which are aspects regarding the content, but also regarding the technicalities. Because we want to learn about how to make these kind of online conferences better, also for future events, because we believe that we will probably continue with physical conferences, but the online aspect, what we all have learned in these pandemic times, the advantages of online conferences, this we will certainly take over also once this pandemic is over. So therefore, we are very interested in your feedback, and you will receive our survey very soon. And we would be very much encourage you and ask you to fill in the survey and to share your insights on how to make these conferences better. There's a second element of feedback that we have also prepared, and those of you who have been already in the opening plenary, they know what I mean. We have again prepared a Mentimeter session for you. And the Mentimeter will ask you one big question that we asked you already, kind of prospectively in the opening plenary, and now we ask it you in the concluding plenary. In the opening, we ask you for your expectations, and now we want to know, what did you take home from the symposium? What are your experiences? And for doing this, you can now take out your telephone, take out any other electronic device that is connected to the internet, and then you have to type in menti.com, this www.menti.com, and then you use our unique code, which is 754569, and you type it in, and then the question is, and you can type more than one word, you can type in anything, you can just type in, what have you learned that you are taking home with you? And I see somebody got great ideas, and this is what we really like to have. And I encourage others to also work on the Mentimeter interface. Groundbreaking ideas. Good, this is an inflation process here. Now it comes. Good. Vivid and inspiring community. This is what we wanted to achieve, and we are extremely grateful that it worked. New frameworks were achieved, new approaches. No friends for life were made. This is because we had no party and no conference dinner. This we understand, but you had at least new connections for future parties, I assume. The research is awesome. I fully agree with this feedback. The global community is no doubt. We had participants from more than 100 countries, large and growing activist scholar community, new frameworks. You all see it on the screen. Constructive comments have been made to the presentation. It's important. We had many early career researchers here at this conference, who some of them had their first international conference presentation. So it was also very useful to have the discussions in a collegial environment and to give very useful comment, which I can see here. And people enjoy that we have a large and growing activist scholars community working on the SDGs, and this is good, and this will also continue. So we have active discussions with some institutions to continue maybe this approach of having global goals conferences around the planet with a strong online element. We have no concrete plans, but seeing that you enjoyed this large community, we are very happy. Somebody complains kind of that we have no natural science missing. This is not necessarily, I mean, we didn't steer in this direction, but these were the abstracts that we received. Inspiration was happening, and collaboration, complexity. Okay. Great ideas and concept for a better world. I mean, this is really, I think, the best comment for the concluding session. And I think this is great feedback, and we will take this all on board, and we will also share our experiences with other partner organizations who are now exploring online conferences. The Earth System Governance Conference in September will also be online. And I changed the slide, and I changed the slide, and this is very good. And now it is really the final part. So now it's really the thank you session. And many of you have been to many international conferences, or the senior ones among you. So you know, at international conference, when you have 1,000 participants, what normally happens is it's a huge enthusiastic finale, so that people are coming to the stage, the student volunteers, the organizers, the keynotes, the entire team is celebrating and celebrated on the screen with loud noises, with group photos, with clapping, with hugging, handshakes, high fives are being made. And all this is not possible, because we here in the Netherlands with our core team, we are still in what our governments call the intelligent lockdown. And that means that our entire student volunteer teams, all the technical facilitators, they're not here. They're all in their various locations, and we have a very limited core team here. And for that reason, we were also asked by our university to stay in the entire local operation here in social distances. So we always had to keep a social distance that is defined in the Netherlands at 1.50 meters. I heard that in Canada, people say the best distance is a hockey stick, and the Australians reportedly say the best distance is the length of a kangaroo. And here in the Netherlands, we say that the best distance is if a Dutch cow can stand between two people. This is what we consider safe. And we have managed for the last 2.5 days to keep this distance for the entire time. So therefore, you will not have any handshakes now, no hugging, no high fives. Rather, we keep our distance, but we will still have a couple of words to say. And thank you for lots of people and organizations that were important to make this online symposium possible. And I start. So I start with thanks to our funders and supporters, because without them, this conference would not have been possible in this way. There were 4 co-hosting organizations that were very important. They were very committed, especially in the beginning, and very important when we thought about a physical event. And all these organizations also are willing to share some of these costs, and this was not necessary in the end anymore. But I'm very grateful for the support of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute at the Monash University in Melbourne in Australia, the German Development Institute in Bonn in Germany, Southern Voice, which is a network of think tanks from the developing countries in particular, working on the SDGs, and the Sussex Sustainability Research Program, which is a joint endeavor of the University of Sussex and the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex. So these are the co-hosts. We are extremely grateful. We are grateful also to the support from Pathways to Sustainability, which is one of the strategic programs of Utrecht University, and they have been very important also in supporting us here. We are grateful to the European Research Council, which is funding the entire operations of the Global Goals project here at Utrecht. The Earth System Governance Project was so kind to endorse our activities because it fits their research agenda, and Utrecht University in general has provided the support, giving us also the facilities here with internet and all these issues to make this possible. Despite the general lockdowns, we got a special permission to be here. We are very grateful to our leadership at Utrecht to make this possible. On this note, it's now time for me to leave this screen and thank you so much, because the rest of the thank you will be done by my good colleagues and friends. So I say goodbye to everybody, and I hope you enjoyed this conference, and I very much hope to see you all physically at some point at the next Global Goals Conference or any of the other international venues where we might engage again, or at online and emails again. So thank you so much, and it was a pleasure being here, and that worked great that so many people were able to join us today. Thank you so much.
Hello, a warm thank you from my side as well. I hope you've been enjoying the past 2.5 days, and that go back to your activities with new insights and hopefully new ideas to collaborate and engage with this great community of researchers and experts on global governance through goals. Of course, this entire event would not have been possible without our dedicated and great conference team, and especially our amazing, fantastic conference manager, Leonie Grob. Leonie, thank you. The HLPF might not be an orchestrator, but you definitely are. Thank you as well to our amazing communications and outreach officer, Charlotte Ballard. Charlotte has been a key in giving this event an online and social media presence. So thank you very much. Thank you as well to our fantastic events manager, Joanne Proctor. Thank you. And I'm kind of running out of synonyms to express greatness, but I also want to thank our great and engaged PhD students, Maya Bochers, Melanie Van Driel, Abby Unita, and Francesco Montesano. Thank you. And last but not least, thank you to our student assistant, very committed student assistant, Julia Fritze. And now I hand over to my colleague.
Yeah, it's of course also my time now to say thank you very much. Okay, that was the correct one. That was a quick insight into what we are doing here behind the scenes. I was not prepared for this slide, but nevertheless, of course, I thank you all. But special thanks from my side go to a couple of people that have been continuously working behind the scenes. Yeah, and we have to highlight them. Many of you during the parallel sessions and also during the plenary sessions have met our wonderful technical facilitators. They have guided us through the parallel sessions and also, of course, yeah, during the pub quiz and the trivia night. So it was wonderful to have you all to support us. So that was, yeah, incredible, I would say. And you did a fantastic job. Thank you very much. Then we also ask, of course, the AV people, and they're now sitting here in the same room. So it's a bit funny because, yeah. Hope you can hear the applause to the AV people, and they really supported us tremendously. And it was great that we could be here in these uncertain times and to have their support. Wonderful. Also in the background, but also on stage, Sandra van der Hel, Jennifer Bansart, and Ina Möller have launched and convened the Early Career Social Lunch. And I think I heard that many early career researchers have participated in this lunch and also benefited from the insights and shared experiences. That was also great that you stepped in last minute, I must say, to convene this great social event during our symposium. Last but not least, I would like to thank Harold van der Kamp. He did a movie, short video. It's a short teaser you will see later on. It's a short one. It's one saying thank you to all of you. That's also from us, for now our turn to say thank you very much to Harold. With that, I hand over to the most important person, Leonie.
Overwhelmed right now, but of course there's a lot of more people to thank. First of all the keynotes that have been presenting during our 4 plenary sessions. Many thanks to you. Of course, also to our over 100 presenters that have been giving insights into their SDG research during the parallel sessions. And well related with this, of course, also all the chairs that have been keeping order during the parallel sessions and have been guiding the discussions in the parallel sessions. And of course, also the discussants that have been well reading into the papers beforehand, preparing constructive feedback to all the presenters. Many thanks to all of you. And of course, also to thank you to all well, you wonderful people out there. It was great that so many of you have been joining and actively participating during the parallel sessions. And we really hope you have been enjoying the last 2.5 days as much as we did. And we also really well hope that we will maybe soon see each other again, maybe in Utrecht. And yes, as Thomas already announced, we just well want to end this Global Goals 2020 Symposium with a short movie for you. And one, yeah. Oh, God.
I mean, Leonie has planned everything at this conference, but what she totally didn't plan is that we also have flowers for her to really thank her so much for the fantastic job that she has done as a conference manager. It was really a fantastic conference and was all possible only because Leonie invested 24 hours for how many weeks to getting this. We thought a lot about flowers. We agreed we didn't know what to do because we're not allowed to hand anything with her and have the 1.50 meters. We had a good idea. We found a table that is exactly 1.50 meters long. So we place here the flowers and we all thank you so much.
Okay, well, I'm even more overwhelmed right now, I think. Well, it was a pleasure. It was, as you said, a lot of work, but I really liked working with the whole team. It was, I was so excited for the Soul Symposium right now, and I'm also, looking forward to some more relaxed days right now again. But still, it was, I'm happy. Thanks to all of you. It was great working with all of you. And well, I just can finish now with, well, thanks to everybody for joining and enjoy our, short movie. Bye.